Okay, so June 24th, 2026, Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the world's nuclear watchdog, walks into a Board of Governors meeting in Vienna. 35 nations are represented in that room. He stands up and briefs them on what his inspectors have found inside Iran's nuclear program. Except, here is the thing. His inspectors have not found anything. Not because Iran's program has stopped, not because the bombs destroyed it, but because for nearly an entire year, not a single IAEA inspector has been allowed inside a single Iranian nuclear facility that actually matters. The sites that were bombed, the sites where the enrichment happened, the tunnels where the uranium is buried, all of them completely dark, completely unmonitored, for almost 12 consecutive months. CNN says the IAEA is urging Iran to cooperate. The Associated Press says the nuclear issue remains unresolved. Reuters says inspectors may return under a secret side letter that American officials are describing to Congress. All of them are asking the same question: will Iran let inspectors back in? That is the wrong question. Because what nobody is sitting with long enough is this. During the same period that the world was watching the war, watching the Strait of Hormuz, watching Versailles, watching Switzerland, Iran's nuclear program has been running in complete darkness. No independent eyes, no verified measurements, no confirmed locations for roughly 1,000 pounds of weapons-grade enriched uranium. And the agreement everybody just signed, the agreement celebrated as a historic breakthrough, specifically says Iran's nuclear status stays exactly as it is for the next 60 days. Today, I want to show you three things. First, exactly how the IAEA blackout happened, because the sequence of events is more deliberate than it looks. Second, what the MOU actually says and doesn't say about nuclear inspections, because the gap between the public description of that document and what the text actually commits Iran to is one of the most important gaps in this entire story. And third, what 1 year of nuclear darkness actually means in practical terms, because I want to show you the specific things that could have happened inside Iran's nuclear program during that blackout window that nobody outside of Iran currently knows about. And as always, I want to be honest with you up front. This is analysis. I could be wrong about parts of this. At the end, I'm going to give you the strongest case for why the situation may be less alarming than it looks. But I think you deserve to understand the full picture before you accept any version of it. Let me start with a concept I want to call the verification vacuum. Here's the simple version. Imagine you have a neighbor who has been quietly building something in their basement for years. Nobody quite knew what it was, but international monitors had been allowed in regularly to check that it wasn't anything dangerous. Then, one night, there is a massive fight. Windows get broken, and your neighbor, in the chaos, kicks the monitors out and locks the door. The fight eventually ends. Everybody signs a piece of paper agreeing to be more peaceful, but nobody has asked the neighbor to unlock the basement yet. And the paper says the basement situation will be discussed in the next 60 days. So right now, the monitors are standing on the front step, the neighbor is inside, and whatever was being built in the basement has had 12 months with no witnesses. That is, in simplified form, the structure of Iran's nuclear situation as of today. Now, I want to add one more layer to this analogy before we move forward, because the details matter. The monitors were not kicked out because the neighbor had something to hide. They were kicked out because the landlord and his friends sent armed men to demolish part of the basement using military-grade explosives, which is arguably illegal under the rules everyone agreed to. The neighbor's anger was real and arguably justified. But the consequence of kicking the monitors out, whatever the reason, is that nobody can see what condition the basement is in anymore. And the paper everyone signed says the basement situation will be discussed, not resolved, and not verified for 60 days. That distinction between discussed and resolved is doing an enormous amount of work in a very small number of words. The verification vacuum is not a technical oversight. It is a strategic environment, and the question you need to sit with is not only whether Iran created it deliberately, but whether Iran intends to let it persist. And whether 12 months of that persistence has already produced changes that 60 days of talks cannot reverse. Okay, evidence block 1, how the blackout actually happened. This is a story that runs back further than most people realize. Since 2018, when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, Iran had been progressively restricting IAEA access step by step. By early 2025, the IAEA had already admitted in writing that it no longer had what it called continuity of knowledge of the state of Iran's nuclear program. Let that phrase land. Continuity of knowledge. That is the technical term inspectors use for the unbroken chain of verified information that tells you a nuclear program is where it says it is and is doing what it says it is doing. By the IAEA's own admission, that chain was already broken before a single bomb dropped. Then, on June 13, 2025, Israel launched its surprise attack on Iran. The United States followed with military strikes on 3 major nuclear facilities, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, using bunker-buster munitions. More than 430 people were killed, including nuclear scientists, according to Iran's health ministry. And in the immediate aftermath, Iran passed a parliamentary law, a binding domestic statute, that suspended the government's cooperation with the IAEA entirely. By early July 2025, all IAEA inspectors had withdrawn from Iran. On August 4th, Iran's foreign ministry confirmed publicly there are no IAEA inspectors in the country. That law passed by the parliament is binding on the government. The elected president and foreign minister cannot simply overrule it without parliamentary consent, which means the suspension of IAEA access is not just a diplomatic posture Tehran can walk back with a phone call. It is a legal structure embedded into Iranian domestic law. Now, by June 4, 2026, the IAEA released its latest quarterly safeguards report, assessed and published by the Institute for Science and International Security, one of the most authoritative non-governmental bodies tracking Iranian nuclear compliance. That report describes, and I want you to hear these exact words, a near-total ongoing loss of monitoring of Iranian nuclear sites. It says, Iran is in active violation of its comprehensive safeguards agreement, including failing to implement notification requirements for new nuclear sites. It says, the IAEA cannot verify whether Iran has suspended enrichment-related activities. It says the IAEA cannot verify whether Iran has suspended reprocessing activities. And on the single most important question, the location and quantity of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile, Grossi told PBS NewsHour directly, there is no information as to the status of the material. He said, and I want to quote him on this, we think that most of the material is still there, meaning buried underground, meaning 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, enough for approximately 11 nuclear weapons by expert estimates, is sitting somewhere inside Iran. And as of the publication of the June 4th report, nobody outside of Iran knows exactly where it is or what condition it is in. Evidence Block 2, what the MOU actually says, because this is where the gap between the headlines and the document text becomes really important. After Versailles, American officials described the agreement as a major step toward resolving the nuclear issue. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, told lawmakers in a closed-door briefing that Iran had agreed in a previously undisclosed side letter to invite IAEA Director General Grossi, along with American nuclear inspectors to Tehran, to locate and identify the highly enriched uranium stockpile. That briefing was reported by multiple outlets. It sounded like a breakthrough, except 2 things happened immediately after. First, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghai, publicly denied that any such invitation had been issued. His exact words were that no such invitation has been given. And second, Baghai explained what Article 9 of the MOU actually says. He said the status of Iran's nuclear program will remain unchanged throughout the 60 days. That routine, IAEA inspections at facilities already subject to monitoring, meaning Bushehr, the civilian power plant, will continue as before. But that any future inspections or renewed access to facilities where IAEA activities were suspended following what he called the criminal military attacks will depend, in his words, on the course and outcome of the forthcoming negotiations. Read that again. The American special envoy tells Congress Iran has agreed to invite nuclear inspectors in, Iran's foreign ministry says no such invitation exists, and the document itself says the nuclear status quo, which includes the full IAEA suspension and the unverified HEU stockpile, is frozen in place for 60 days while negotiations happen. You have an American official describing a breakthrough in a classified congressional briefing, and the other side of the agreement denying that breakthrough exists in public on the same day. When two governments cannot agree on whether a secret side letter exists, that is not a minor implementation detail. That is a fundamental dispute about what was actually agreed to. And the side that is denying it is the side that physically controls the uranium. I also want to walk you through what the MOU actually commits Iran to on the nuclear question, because the text has been published in full by NPR and others, and you can read it yourself. Point 8 says, Iran reaffirms it shall not procure or develop nuclear weapons. It also commits to resolving the disposition of stockpiled enriched material with the minimum methodology, being downblending on-site under IAEA supervision. But it does not define a timeline for that downblending. It does not define when inspectors must be admitted. It does not include, and IPAC's own analysis confirmed this explicitly, any mechanism to reimpose sanctions if Iran fails to comply. The MOU is also entirely silent on Iran's ballistic missile program and silent on Iran's centrifuge rebuilding capacity. The document that everyone is calling a nuclear framework has no inspector access date, no verification mechanism, and no enforcement clause. It says the minimum outcome of future talks will be downblending. It does not say when that outcome must be reached, or what happens if it isn't. Evidence block 3. What 12 months of darkness actually means in practice. And this is the part that I think is the most underreported dimension of this entire story, because people keep asking whether Iran will allow inspectors in. But the question nobody is asking is what 12 months of no inspectors actually means for what we know and don't know right now. Let me walk you through 3 critical issues that lie at the center of this entire debate. They are not minor technical details or obscure policy questions. They are the very pieces of information that determine whether the world truly understands the current state of Iran's nuclear program or whether it is operating in a dangerous information vacuum. The first issue concerns Iran's centrifuge facilities. In June 2025, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against 3 of Iran's most important nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. In the immediate aftermath, officials in both Washington and Tel Aviv celebrated the attacks as a major strategic victory. Public statements claimed that Iran's nuclear program had been set back by as much as 2 years. The message presented to the world was clear. The threat had been significantly reduced, and Iran's ability to enrich uranium had been severely degraded. But when we examine the International Atomic Energy Agency's June 2026 Safeguards Report, a far more complicated picture emerges. The IAEA stated explicitly that it had not reported any major changes to its assessment of Iran's nuclear program. That sentence may sound technical and bureaucratic, but its implications are enormous. The very organization responsible for independently verifying the condition of Iran's nuclear infrastructure is essentially saying that it cannot confirm the optimistic claims being made by governments because it has not had the access necessary to inspect the damaged facilities. In simple terms, the assertion that the strikes successfully crippled Iran's nuclear program rests primarily on intelligence assessments provided by the United States and Israel rather than on independent verification by international inspectors. This distinction matters immensely. Satellite imagery can reveal destroyed buildings, collapsed structures, and visible damage on the surface. Analysts from organizations such as Chatham House and experts like David Albright of the Institute for Science and International Security have pointed to evidence showing that certain workshops and production facilities at the Karaj site appear to have been destroyed. Yet visible destruction and the elimination of nuclear capability are not the same thing. A photograph taken from space cannot tell us whether centrifuges have been rebuilt in underground facilities. It cannot determine whether equipment was relocated before the strikes, or whether replacement production lines are already operating elsewhere. Nuclear programs are not merely collections of buildings. They are networks of engineers, expertise, supply chains, and institutional knowledge. Those elements do not disappear simply because several facilities have been bombed. The second issue involves Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Under Iran's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, IAEA inspectors are legally required to verify the country's stockpile of highly enriched uranium every 30 days. This is not a political preference or a voluntary arrangement. It is a binding obligation embedded within the framework of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Yet Iran has now missed nearly 12 consecutive monthly verification windows. The last confirmed assessment of the stockpile occurred before the June 2025 strikes. Since then, the international community has been operating with increasingly outdated information. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi acknowledged in an interview with PBS that the general consensus, including among Iranian officials themselves, is that most of the material is still present and likely remains underground. But the phrase, "still there," should not be mistaken for certainty. The agency does not know whether the material remains in the same location. It cannot confirm whether the uranium has been moved to different facilities, processed further, or enriched to even higher levels. It cannot verify whether portions of the stockpile have been converted into other forms or hidden in undisclosed locations. And perhaps most importantly, without inspector access, it cannot know. When the IAEA says that it cannot verify whether Iran has suspended enrichment-related activities, it is not engaging in diplomatic ambiguity or carefully chosen wording. It is communicating something far more serious. It literally lacks the information necessary to make that determination. The third issue concerns time. Even if we assume that the June 2025 strikes significantly damaged Iran's nuclear infrastructure, 12 months represents a substantial reconstruction period. Before the strikes occurred, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization had already confirmed that the country possessed a record quantity of highly enriched uranium. Decades of investment had produced not only physical infrastructure, but also a sophisticated scientific and industrial ecosystem capable of rebuilding damaged facilities. The engineers survived. The technical knowledge survived. The procurement networks survived. The manufacturing capabilities survived. The underground construction expertise survived. Mark Fitzpatrick, former head of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, has repeatedly argued that the central question is not whether Iran's program suffered damage. The real question is how quickly Iran can repair, replace, or reconstitute what was lost. 12 months without inspections is more than enough time to make that question extraordinarily difficult to answer. And that is the heart of the problem. The world is being asked to assume that a nuclear program has been significantly degraded while simultaneously acknowledging that the very organization responsible for verification has not been able to inspect the facilities in question for nearly a year. In nuclear diplomacy, assumptions are not enough. Verification is everything.